Hi, and welcome to episode 11, The Value of Currency and Macroeconomics. So this will be part 1 of part 2, and we filmed it about a week ago, but apparently due to technical problems it was eaten. So we have to do it again. Isn't that fun? Okay, so the thing about macroeconomics is most people don't seem to really understand what that is exactly. And so that's why we're explaining it here, but I'm not going to give you a textbook explanation for it. I'm going to give you more of a hands-on explanation for it. Now, so most people don't know the difference between macro and microeconomics, and actually it's very much a part of the Republican agenda that they hope and assume that you don't know or understand the difference, because they exploit this misunderstanding and this ignorance, this overwhelming ignorance that apparently exists, to push their agenda further. Because when it comes to basically their economic agenda, they are completely in support of corporations, and that's a problem. So if you don't realize that you're actually voting against your best interests when you vote because of Republican economic agendas, then I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, so it's like I said, the agenda is centered on macroeconomics and microeconomics, and they assume that you don't understand microeconomics. And basically, in a nutshell, it's they say, well, you can't manage your household like that. You can't have debt when you manage your household. Well, your household finances have nothing to do with countries' finances and countries dealing with other countries. And we'll explain what the differences are. And so since they push this agenda, this is how they support, or they create the narrative to get support for their actions that they do when they threaten these shutdowns. So they're like, no, we can't have any more taxes, we can't have any more debt, that's final, we're going to, we don't care if we have to shut down the government if we have to, because we're not going to approve of a budget that goes any higher. And that is so ridiculous and dangerous to the whole entire world economy that it really should be criminal. And it actually is criminal in any other country. Just in America, the forefathers, oops, they forgot to think about that. And so that's actually the reason why America's credit rating is not the highest in the world. It should be AAA+. The only reason it's not is because a couple of years ago, when John Boehner tried to shut down the government, he did actually shut down the government, but he almost got the United States to default on some of its loans, simply because we did not have the mechanism to pay the loans anymore, not because we didn't have the money. And that was like his agenda, was to do that. And if that would have happened, that would have had an absolutely catastrophic effect on the world economy in a way that nobody has ever seen before. I mean, you can't imagine, you talk about world economic crisis of 2009, you've seen nothing yet if the United States defaults on any of its loans. And we'll explain that more later too. But that's why it should be criminal. It really should be a criminal act to play these games that the Republicans play every time they try to get a budget passed. Okay. So basically, there was a war at the end of World War II between the people and corporations. And yay, corporations, boo, people, right? Because the corporations, they won, yay. And they absolutely won. And the first thing that they tried to do was they tried to skirt around antitrust laws. And they've successfully done that now. And basically, there are no antitrust laws, monopolies, all good, yay, monopolies. And this is something that actually the forefathers did know about, and did think about, and did try to prevent, but it just doesn't matter. The corporations got around it anyway. And then when they passed Citizens United, well, that was the end of the war right there. And so once corporations actually had basically a voting entity and they became more important than people. So like if somebody owes, if you get a judgment against a private individual, good luck collecting it. But if a corporation gets a judgment against a private individual, well, they pursue it relentlessly. And it's a whole different, because they're more important, and their agenda and their interests are way more important than the people, and that's clear in America. That's very clearly the agenda there. Okay, so the reason why it shouldn't be a problem to raise the debt mainly is because the U.S. is the world reserve currency, and that's very, very important, and we'll get to that later too. But basically, to explain how that works, I'm going to explain about currency. And basically, all currency has always been based on credit. It certainly is now, but actually it has always been, even since ancient times. Even when we thought we were on a gold and silver standard, it wasn't entirely, because it was still influenced by the commodities market of what gold is, which is a commodity, and the fact that it can go up and down. And so it wasn't really a standard anymore, because, and if you think that that gold is money, just ask the Spanish about that. They found out the hard way, the really hard way. They went to the New World looking for gold and silver, and they found a lot of it. Yay, gold and silver! And so what did that do? That devalued gold and silver. So they didn't win. And so relying upon the idea that gold is money destroyed Spanish Empire, and they crumbled so badly that in the early 1900s it was pathetic. The situation there was really desperate, and that's what ultimately caused the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, and the rise of Franco, who was a dictator. Hooray! So, okay, so the other thing that the Republican agenda pushes is that it basically implies that all debt is bad. You don't want debt, but actually debt can be a good thing. There is bad debt and there is good debt. Now, bad debt is like a car loan. That's bad debt. But there's good debt too, and the way that you manage debt is actually the way that you can become personally wealthy. And it's the way that countries become wealthy too, is the way that they manage their debt. And America actually has a gigantic advantage in managing debt, in that they are, like I said, the world's reserve currency. Okay, but the Republicans say all debt is bad. Okay, so the way that you handle your finances, and when your wife says, honey, we can't afford to buy this because we have to pay this bill, and we have to budget this much money each month from our income in order to pay our bills, that's how you handle your personal finances, and that's how even a small factory does their finances and their economics. And so microeconomics applies even to a company as large as a small factory. That's still microeconomics. It's still not macroeconomics. So macroeconomics, when we talk about macroeconomics, we're talking about things like here, things like GDP, which stands for gross domestic product. We're talking about trade deficits or surpluses, balance of trade. We're talking about G to G. That's government to government transactions. We're talking about metric tons. We're talking about tariffs. Those are terms that we use for macroeconomics. Those are not microeconomics, that's macroeconomics. Now, if the U.S. did default, basically it would destroy the world economy. And to get into that, I'll have to explain about what what it means to be the world reserve currency. But that's the reason why. And liberals, Republicans also have the same agenda as libertarians in a lot of ways when they say that, oh, the U.S. prints too much money. In fact, they print too much money that it's devalued it. And it's a U.S. dollar is not worth anything anymore. Obviously, those people don't do a lot of traveling because, in fact, the U.S. dollar is stronger, or at least as strong as it has ever been. And sure, a loaf of bread doesn't cost a nickel anymore, but that's normal. You always have inflation, gradual inflation each year, and over the course of 90 years, it's going to cost a lot more for a loaf of bread. But everything, it's all relative, you know. I mean, whether 100 of your currency is equal to $1 US, or 1,000 of your currency, or 8,000 of your currency is worth $1 US, everything is all relative. And so whether $1 US can buy a loaf of bread, or it could buy 10 loaf of breads, is all based, 20 years ago or whatever. It's all relative. It's all relative. Okay, and so. But anytime you hear somebody saying that, oh, the U.S. prints too much money and we got to go back to the gold standard because the money is not worth anything and we need to abolish the Fed, where they talk about the year 1913, anybody that does that in one of these threads that you see on social media, you know that that person is a libertarian. Right away you can identify that person, libertarian. Libertarians don't often even realize that they're libertarians. Of course, they're like, I'm not a libertarian, I just know what the right thing is. They're just following a libertarian agenda, like an obedient lemming. Just like most people follow some kind of an agenda. Okay. And, but actually, their agenda is very similar to the Republican agenda. And basically, they want you to have no faith in the U.S. dollar. They also don't want public transportation or any kind of public works at all, because that's going to cost money. The corporations have to pay, basically. And so that's what the whole debt thing is all about. Corporations are so rich, and the country is so rich, that they're so cheap that if they pay... And the reason is, and this is why they got rid of so many jobs during COVID, because that was very intentional. Because that's the new assault, is we're assaulting the job market now. We're assaulting payroll. Because payroll had always traditionally been the largest part of anybody's expenses, any business's expenses. So they're attacking payroll now. And so even if you raise the debt $20,000, and it causes a corporation to have to lay off somebody because they have to pay $20,000 more in taxes this year, that's another job that they have to get rid of in order to continue to show growth. Not to make profits, to show growth, because what matters is that they show growth. Okay, so actually the Republican agenda actually pushes gold, and pushes gold on the American public, who are unsuspecting and basically ignorant, and they don't understand, and they think that it's money. And they want you to have the idea that the U.S. dollar is going to collapse any day now. That's not going to happen. And in fact, not only isn't it going to happen anytime soon, and nobody in the world wants that to happen, actually. I mean, maybe Putin, but other than that, really, not even the Chinese. Nobody wants that to happen. Okay, so what does it mean that the U.S. dollar is a world reserve currency? Okay, so that means that every country that trades in dollars trades in U.S. it does trade. So like G to G, any G to G transaction is done in U.S. dollars. And the reason why, Ed, what have you done? Okay, and the reason why is because it's a reliable source. We know the value of that. So if you try to do it in yuan or something like that, a currency that is non-convertible, you don't really know what it's really worth. And so but the dollar, though, you can be pretty confident. There's only one country that doesn't actually trade in U.S. dollars, and that's called Zimbabwe. And basically, with Zimbabwe, they are controlled by the Chinese completely. The Chinese have tried to do it with Kazakhstan, but they can't quite get there. They've just done it with resources like oil and things like that. But Zimbabwe, they completely control the country. And what happened is that Zimbabwe at one time was a first world country, and they were equal with South Africa, and they had a high standard of living, and there was basically no difference between living in Zimbabwe or in South Africa, or at that time it was called okay, so Zimbabwe, which used to be called Rhodesia and Nyasaland, was a very wealthy country, and basically when Mandela took over South Africa, it created a whole wave of basically native governance. And when that happened in Zimbabwe, the native people that took over the government mismanaged it so badly that within 15 years it went from a first world nice place to live to a third world nightmare. And so basically they experienced the same kind of inflation that Germany experienced around 100 years ago in like 1922. So they were desperate, and so they reached out to anybody that would help them, and of course the Chinese stepped up and said, we'll help you. And the Chinese said to them, look, we'll fix all your problems, but you're going to have to accept the Chinese yuan as your reserve currency, and you're going to have to do all G to G transactions in Chinese yuan. And they were like, okay, anything, anything, anything. But so now what that means is that they can only trade with China. They can't buy goods now from any other country other than China, because nobody else wants to take Chinese yuan. And the reason why is because it's not convertible. And the reason why it's not convertible is because they're not transparent. And they do that intentionally. And we'll get back to that later. So the US dollar is a world reserve currency to the point to where many countries like South America and in Africa, even in Asia, do not even bother to print their own currency. For example, when I was living in Cambodia for a little while, in Cambodia all transactions are done in US dollars. So you buy a pair of shoes in Cambodia, you pay them, literally you pay them, you hand them US dollars. If it's $20 or if it's $19.45, they'll hand you back 55 cents in Cambodian money. So they do the change in Cambodian money. Nobody does coins, but they'll take the US dollars and they'll hand you back the change in Cambodian money. But other countries use the US dollar exclusively. They don't bother to print their own currency in any way at all, because, you know, let's face it, it's expensive to print currency. Furthermore, being the world reserve currency, that means if there is a, let's say, a bauxite mine in Africa, in West Africa, and they want to sell, let's say, 20 or 50 tons of bauxite to an aluminum plant or aluminum production facility in, let's say, Brazil, where they make a lot of aluminum, the transaction is done in US dollars. It's not done in Brazilian currency, it's not done in West African currency, or yuan, or euro, or the ruble. It's done in US dollars exclusively. Okay. Other currencies that might be used as a world reserve currency that potentially that could be, I mean, the problem with most currencies is that there's not enough of it. So for example, the Singapore dollar is quite stable now, especially since Hong Kong has kind of eliminated themselves as a competitor. When China took over Hong Kong, they were like, oh, we're going to keep all the same programs and all the same policies in place. Well, we knew that that wouldn't happen, and in fact, that's not what happened. And as a result, Hong Kong no longer is the center of business in Asia, it's now Singapore. And part of the reason why is because of currency. The Hong Kong dollar is now tied to the Chinese yuan, which is tied to, artificially, which is tied to the US dollar directly. And it's artificially manipulated. And so that's really hurt banking and other financial institutions, and there were a lot of them, and they've moved all to Singapore now. Even Standard & Poor's, they're all in Singapore. Okay, and so, but the problem with Singapore dollars is that to do a G2G transaction, like 50,000 metric tons of bauxite, there's not enough Singapore currency in the world to be able to finance that transaction. So that's one problem. And so that's the problem with several other currencies too, like also Swiss francs, things like that. You couldn't use that either. And like I said, the Chinese yuan is totally is not free floating. It's totally artificially manipulated. And that there's a reason why. They do it on purpose. It's because it's part of their whole business model that they started in around 1990, which was to try to attract manufacturing to China. And the way that they do that is, so right now the Chinese dollar trades on about 6.2 to 1. And it's been like that for like the last 10 years. But it really, if they were to be more transparent and they were to allow Standard & Poor's or Moody's or somebody to really look at their books and evaluate their currency, it would probably trade at more like about 2.5. And if they did that, that would completely destroy their entire business model. Because in China, the yuan trades like $1. So a pair of shoes costs $30, a meal might cost like 8 yuan, the rent might cost 600 yuan, your electricity might cost 60 yuan, something like that. It's very relative to dollars. And so, but outside, in real money, it's not. So like when we paid our employees in China, let's say 1,000 yuan in a month, well, you can live on 1,000 yuan a month in China, but in real dollars, it was only $160. And so that's exactly what happens at Chinese factories. They're not actually making just $160, they're making like $1,000 in their money to spend domestically in China. It spends like it's $1,000 a month, but in real money it's $160. So if the Chinese yuan went to 2.5 to 1, you might say, hey, that's great for China, their currency value went up, woohoo, isn't that good? No, it's a bad thing if you want manufacturing, because what that would mean is that $1,000 now is like $450. And so that makes it, when you include shipping costs, it makes it not really cheaper anymore. So it would totally destroy their whole business model. So that's why they don't want that to happen. And that's why they don't want to have transparency, and they're never going to have transparency. And actually, China holds the most US dollars and the most gold outside of the United States. So that's another thing. Okay, and so it's basically impossible to replace the US dollar. I guess the next closest thing would be the euro, but if you wanted to use, the problem with using the euro, and the euro is pretty strong, but the problem with using the euro is that they've got countries like Greece and Poland, Slovakia, countries like that, that they admit in to the EU that significantly drag down the value of the euro. And it's kind of like when the United States, during the Carter administration, was going to vote to have Puerto Rico be the 51st state. That ultimately was voted against, and it's never come back up for a vote ever again, because basically it would be an economic disaster. They would not be a benefit at all. They would just be a liability. They would require all kinds of federal funds. There's hurricanes there every winter, and they make nothing. And they don't really add a lot in tourist trade or whatever. They would be a complete liability. And that's what it is when they bring in Poland or something. And if the EU would bring in Ukraine, that would also be a liability, unless they could also bring in the Crimea, which is where all the natural resources are, as well as the port. That's why Russia wanted to control the Crimea, and that's why we had wars over the Crimea with the British back in the 1840s. So And so when Putin says, oh, well, Europe and the EU and NATO are aggressively trying to spread eastward into and encroaching in my territories or my former territories, he's exactly right. That is happening, and that is their agenda. And they are intentionally doing that. And that's why he's trying to make a stand in Ukraine and say, no mas, no further eastward. Actually, he doesn't say no mas, it's Spanish. He would say it in Russian. He'd say, niet, that you can't go any further east. All right, so that's, so we can't use the ruble, and that the problem with the euro is that you bring in these other countries, which is their agenda to move east, but you bring in these other countries and it devalues the euro. So that makes it volatile. All right, so instead all countries want US dollars, and they continue to want US dollars. And the reason why this does not, this helps the United States, because it's kind of like the story of the Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card. And the way that I'll explain it is like, okay, so when Upper Deck came out in 1989, And especially when they had the #1 card being Ken Griffey Jr., who was a rookie that year, that rookie card became very valuable right away, and it kind of created the whole fad, the whole boom in baseball cards that everybody wanted to collect. Now you've got actual investors who are being told by their investment consultants to invest in baseball cards as a commodity, as an investment. Because over the last 10 years, baseball cards have gone up in value. Well, just like most currencies or whatever, if you make too much of them, then they go down in value. But nobody noticed it with the Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card because he was such a great player and so dynamic and popular, and that Upper Deck just ran the presses, and they ran them all night long. In fact, they ran the presses to just make Ken Griffey Jr. cards. And so there's whole sheets out there of nothing but Ken Griffey Jr. Upper Deck totally against their license and against their trademark and everything else of Major League Baseball, violated everything just so they could print as many of these as they could possibly print. But up until around 2001, nobody cared. Because everybody liked them. Everybody wanted them. Nobody was looking to get rid of Ken Griffey Jr. rookie cards. When he went to the Reds, he got into his 30s, he had lots of injuries, his career started to decline. He still made the Hall of Fame, but he wasn't the greatest player in the world anymore. And so people were like, well, I think I'll sell my Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card. And when they discovered that everybody else, literally, and their brother, had them already, then the value of the cards went way down. And that ultimately collapsed the whole fad of the whole baseball card fad, and it was gone. Okay? But US dollars are not a fad. And so that's a big difference. And so when the Republicans want to say that, oh, we can't raise the debt. You know, it's kind of like a millionaire whose wife says, honey, we can't go from $1,000 a month to $1,200 a month for our expenses. What's the difference? It's not that big a deal. It's really not that big of a deal. Believe me, America can afford it. And if we didn't spend so much money on defense, we could afford it a lot easier. But even if we did have trouble paying bills, anybody would give us a loan because we're the world reserve currency. And even if we needed to get a quick $25 million to pay a bill, we literally could just print $25 million to pay that bill, and it would not affect the world economy or the value of the dollar or anything. It's not enough for it to affect that. So even in the worst case scenario, we could do that. And so there's absolutely no reason to make it a big deal to raise the debt. I mean, obviously you can't just double it or triple it, or you just can't be totally fiscally irresponsible about it, but a little bit higher, it's not that big a deal, especially when it's to fund very important programs. And that's the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics, which is the economics in your own household, is that the U.S. can print more money anytime it needs it. It doesn't hurt the value of it, and you can't. Okay. So I think that will wrap it up for part 1. Please stay tuned for part 2 coming soon. And please remember to like and share. And I think you can subscribe in some way. And that would be great. And we'll see you next time. I'm Scott Houston. You've been looking at Learning with Power. Thank you very much.